Strelchek,
Here.
Alderwoman Tolaco,
Here.
Alderman Meyer,
Here.
Alderman Hancher,
Here.
Alderman Bach,
Here.
Alderman Parrish,
Here.
Alderwoman Schneider,
Here.
Alderman Gebhardt,
Here.
Mayor Nurbin.
Here, I'll go back to agenda item number 2 and we'll do the pledge of allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands.
We'll get right into the meat of it here. First up was an overview of fiscal 2024. Administrator Jones and the Finance Department will take over.
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. Members of the committee, welcome to this evening's budget workshop. This is really the first step, or the first foray, rather, for members of the Common Council to engage in an overview and certainly some conversation regarding the budget development process that is now underway here in the organization, and that is continuing up until the point where we'll be distributing a draft budget for your consideration approximately 1 month from today. So staff has put together a presentation that we'd like to walk you through, covering some of the components that were included in the budget meeting packet that was distributed last week. And if you really think about it, stepping back for just a moment before we get into the nitty-gritty of the budget, this year, 2023, has been, in some respects, a new normalization, as I like to call it. While we're doing a lot of the things that we normally do as an organization, we've got new components to what we normally do. We have a new arrangement for our fire department with the village of Thiensville. We have joint emergency dispatch with Ozaukee County. We have 3 new members of this governing body, which is a third of all of its members. We joined the League of Wisconsin Municipalities after a multi-year hiatus starting this year, and we've also switched to their insurance program, and we're in the process of normalizing some of the coverages and the programs that the League offers through that package. There's also a new state budget, which will be impacting some of the conversations we have here tonight, and into appropriations. We'll be normalizing some of those revenues and some of those decisions that have come out of Madison. And then there are a variety of other projects and initiatives underway. Certainly the compensation plan that was wrapped up late last year and introduced and discussed earlier this year is part of what we're doing relative to the budget process. We're implementing e-poll books through the ARPA spending program and other initiatives that will become part of the new normal here in the city in terms of how we operate and deliver services to the community. So against that backdrop, tonight's agenda will include, as outlined in the packet, an overview of fiscal year 2023, some of the budget development considerations that we would like the council to be aware of as we put forth our effort to deliver you a budget over the next couple of weeks. A review of where we are from a capital financing perspective, both on a pay-as-you-go basis as well as debt financing that we've used over the years. We'll talk a little bit about the component units of government, specifically the library and the Southern Ozaukee Fire Department, and where we are relative to those budget processes. And then we thought we'd give you a little update on where we are from an ARPA spending perspective. And most, if not all, of this information was presented in the packet. So if you've had a chance to review those materials, none of this is going to come as earth-shattering or shocking information. And really, and I heard a little scuttle before the meeting was called to order, you know, what are we doing here tonight? This is really a chance to give you an overview, or us rather, to give you an overview of the budget landscape and some of the factors that we're up against. It's an opportunity for council members to ask questions if things aren't clear, to provide input to staff before we wrap up the document that'll be moving forward for your consideration. And we'll be setting the table for some of the future meetings that we'll be having to review potential changes to the fee schedule, the Appropriations Committee meeting, which will be occurring in early October, and then the sewer and the water utility budget meetings, which we're hoping to have again sometime in late October or early November. We'll also decide here tonight if any additional meetings are necessary based on the collective will of the group here at large. So with that, lastly, kind of bringing it home before we get into the numbers tonight, the building blocks of our strategic plan are lined up here on the screen. And in the very middle of the screen is financial stewardship, one of the five key focus areas that the council identified when we put together our strategic plan early last year. And as you branch out horizontally and vertically, public safety does not happen without the good stewardship of our finances to serve the community. The same thing with capital improvements, and certainly there are a number of capital needs across the organization. They're evident in the capital plan, but good financial stewardship gives us the opportunity to pursue and accomplish some of those projects. And when you underlay that underneath the two other areas, the key focus areas, customer service and quality of life, this is what makes for an outstanding community, which Mequon continues to be for the residents that live here, for the businesses that locate here, for the students that come to learn here, and the other visitors that will be coming, say, in 2 weeks for the Taste of Mequon. So it all pulls together, and this is the lens by which we're really operating as a team to put together a document that's responsive to both the needs of the organization and the needs of the community in the coming fiscal year. So, with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Engroff, our Finance Director. She's going to walk the council through an overview of 2023, where we are on the revenue and expenditure side, and talk a little bit about some of the fund balances that were also included in your packet. Jen.
Yes, thank you, and good evening, everyone. We'll start with revenues, and so we're looking at revenues through July 31st, and so the benchmark being 58%, 7 out of the 12 months of the year, and so just to lay the foundation in terms of the color coding, that 58%, so we're looking at revenues, so 58% or more would be in green. If it was a 5% variance, 53 to 58% would be in yellow, and then 53% or less would be in red. But if we go down to overall, we're at about 50% of that 58%, so we do have some room to make up. But if we just look directly at the first line item, taxes, we'll be at 100% at the end of August, actually last week. We're at 100%, which will bring us to about 67% overall. So a lot of these variances that you see in red, really the majority of them are timing differences. So while we might be doing a straight line budget monthly, the actuals are recorded unevenly throughout the year. Also for state shared revenue, much of that is recorded at the back end of the year, or for our internal fees or other fees, other revenues. Those are annual processes that are done at the end of the year, so we won't be recording that revenue until December. So that makes up a large majority of those variances. But the key, I think, area to look at is really permits, inspection revenue. So we're tracking actually to 2020 levels. So if you look there, they're at 40%, and we're looking to be, closer to 58%. That's almost 20%. That we're off. So we're projecting potentially, $200,000 to $250,000 shortfall there, about 30%. But if we take a look at investment revenue, that has really been outperforming this year, and it will continue to grow through the end of the year. And the hope is that we'll be able to make up much of that shortfall within permits. And the driver within permits is interest rates are so high right now. It's the year before an election. It seems after speaking with the inspections department, other municipalities in the area are experiencing the same thing. 25 to 35% shortfalls within permitting. So with that, let's move to expenditures. So so again, looking at expenditures through July 31st with that same benchmark, the 58%. And so really, if you look, down to the bottom line, 57.14%, we're right there overall. So the majority of the departments are tracking right to budget. There are, notably similar to the revenue side of things, there are those timing differences, so that, the line items in red are all really timing differences, especially with fire and library. For fire, we've already funded their full funding for the year because they had a delay on the ambulance revenue coming in, and they're a startup, so they needed, some funds to start paying their expenditures. So we've been pre-funding that. And so that's the driver there. Also with clerks, there's a small gap there to identify as well. We budgeted 3 elections and we had 4, and the last one being in July. So there's a little bit to make up there. There's a couple other areas in yellow due to some, high material costs due to inflationary pressures, as well as with repairs and maintenance. But overall, we're tracking nicely to budget.
So just one point of clarification. At 4:30, Jennifer and Marie and I were going through the PowerPoint, and they both pointed out to me that these two numbers needed to be flip-flopped. And I think I did that in real time on the screen, and I forgot to hit save. So if those numbers look out of whack, they are. They should be flipped, and the 1.3 should be here, and the 152 should be here for communications. But bottom line, we're going to continue to manage expenses to budget, such that if we're a little short on revenues here this year, relative to building permits or otherwise, we're gonna feather our expenditure level between now and the end of the year so as to ensure a positive variance at year's end when we go into audit. So that's the goal.
Did the pool really, is it gonna finish like below budget? Looks like expenses are really low so far for the year with only a month to go on this spreadsheet. It's like 40,000 below. I was just surprised. Normally the pool expense is way over.
Well, we had a budget amendment to the pool that was approved by the council back in, I want to say, July, and that took the budget amount up by approximately $10,000 or $15,000, which I think is going to give us the capacity to keep expenditures at budget for the year. The pool just closed on Sunday. That was our last day of operations. So at this point in time, we should not have too many more expenses once we close out the last payroll for the year. It's a little early to say whether or not we're going to be under budget or over budget, but I would anticipate, if I'm guessing, that we'll be right around budget on the expenditure side.
And there's one other thing that I would add, and that happens probably in October, is we have to settle with the other pools. So if more are going to, say, Cedarburg, we end up having to pay them, and so that's the case here. So there's a process with that super pass to kind of settle, and we ended up paying a sizable amount for that.
So Mayor, at this point, just building off of Alderman Parrish's question, we could stop here and see if there are any other questions relative to fiscal year 2023.
It's always appropriate time to ask questions. That's a good question on the pool, but we kind of called a mulligan a couple months ago and reset the budget for the year.
Yes.
Are those inspections, is that just new home inspections, or is that everything, when you're talking about that inspections?
Inspections, electric, plumbing, you're talking revenue,
okay.
or are you talking on the expenditure side?
On the, on the expenditure, or no, right here on the revenue side. That's everything.
Yeah, that's everything.
That's building permits, electrical permits, HVAC, plumbing permits, new occupancy permits, permit revenue that's otherwise forfeited through deposits. It's any and all permit revenue collected through the inspections division.
So is in general, the building is down, or is it just people aren't getting their inspections? I mean, is it,
Oh, building's down.
building is down, so that's the
Money got
driver.
expensive, so building is down.
Okay. That's what I thought.
So playing off of that, 10% down in the first half of the year for 7 months. You said that it could be as high as a 30% hit. Are you expecting the back half of the year to continue as the foresight that that's going to continue to decrease the revenue that's coming in for the permits?
It's very difficult to project,
Okay.
but that is what we are envisioning. So, you know, we're shortfall of about 18%, and we are, for the full year, projecting about 30. So there's
18,
about
that's
12% that we're still going to factor in through
That's
the end
right.
of the year. So yes, we're factoring in a shortfall through the end of the year.
Okay.
What is the composite of the internal services fees?
That's really the charge back to the utilities. So the city, largely it's city staff who are, their expenses are booked to the general fund. So for example, I'm very involved in creating the budgets for the utilities. So that expense is charged back to the utilities. Or, you know, Marie does the utility bills on a quarterly basis, and there's a lot of work that goes into that process. But that's every, you know, all staff within the city, there's a charge back. So that would be for the city, charging back to water, sewer.
So at year end, those.
So we don't calculate those as it goes throughout the year?
No, it's a year-end process.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't produce monthly or quarterly financials. I mean, we do for quarterly, but we just don't book entries to adjust throughout the year. It's really just, we're cash basis essentially throughout the year until year end.
Okay, shall we move on?
Going once, twice?
Oh, yep. Okay.
Okay, taking a look at fund balance. So fund balance is really our cash reserves or retained earnings in the for-profit world. And so we're looking at 4 years here, 3 years of actuals, and then we're projecting 2023. We'll start with the general fund. And so per our financial policy, we're looking for this to be about 10 to 12% fund balance, unassigned fund balance. And so for the first couple of years, we're tracking right at that 2.3 million or 13%. And then last year we went down to about 9%, and there were two main drivers of that. We did have, council approved one-time expenditures, so that was about half, right around 300,000, and then we did, we had to fund Southern Ozaki Fire Department, their Q1 payment, so that was just over 300,000. So that impacts the general fund unassigned fund balance, but that's really a timing difference. And so the plan then to be at the end of the year is we anticipate we'll be about break even, hopefully even positive ideally, but we're projecting here to be break even, and that we will not have to pre-fund Southern Ozaki their Q1 payment because their ambulance revenues are coming in and they'll be in a good place come the end of the year. Then moving to park impact fees, as you can see, the balance has grown. It's almost doubled in the last 4 years due to development within the city. And so, we've let that continue to grow, and the plan, I believe, is to fund the Lemke Park Pavilion with that in the near future. And then the revolving loan fund, that too has been growing over the years due to principal and interest payments being received on emergency loans as well as revolving loans. And especially in the last year it's grown because we haven't issued any new loans year to date. And then we have the debt service levy, which it hovers right around, zero. The levy pays for the principal and interest payments. And then we have TID 2, or the business park. Right now it's negative, but by the time the TID closes and we have that additional increment every year coming in, it should be in the positive. And then we have the TID 3 town center, which has continued to grow due to the success of the town center, and those funds will largely pay for all the improvements that are happening. So I think I can pass it back
Okay.
to Will
Any-
Jones unless there's
Any
questions.
questions on the fund balance?
Yeah, TID three, we're tracking in the right direction, but do we know where the dollar amount that's committed and when we expect that to close? Is there an update on that? Based on the expenditures, are we just waiting to see what expenditures are? I mean, I know that we've planned accordingly up to this point, I'm just looking for a benchmark.
Well, I think we'll know more once we close out the project here, the public improvements that are currently underway along Mequon Road and the OIT. And once we have a final accounting of that project, which included a rather significant contingency of about $500,000, we'll probably be able to sit down with Ellers, our financial advisor, and maybe get an updated projection on potential closure.
Is it on budget as far as you're aware?
As far as
That
I'm
was my
aware,
question.
everything is on budget relative to the project currently.
Yeah,
Yeah, the project's on budget, and right now the closure is slated for 2020.
that's great.
There's been some use of contingency, but very, very limited.
Yeah. I just wanted to know how that budget was working, the
Yeah.
roads. The road's been torn up for a while, school's starting, it's gonna be backed up, people are gonna be asking questions. Just
Yeah.
wanted to share that it's a success, as we all know, so,
Yep.
that's great.
Hi. What was the seed capital for SOFD again? And was that part of the drop from,
It wasn't
It's
seed capital.
The
it was
first
just-
quarter payment, so it wasn't really, so
I
it
thought
was
we
like 336,000.
didn't we transfer some reserves and kind of just to get them going, or there was none of that injection early on? No?
That was that.
That was a
That's what it was.
different, smaller amount, but that was
Okay.
just reserved, not operating income.
Great. And then I would just point out that the park's impact fee is gonna be all used on Lemke, 100% of it, so that will be zero soon.
I am trying to wrap my head around a few things here, so forgive me if I'm asking some ignorant questions, but as it relates to the general fund, I saw in the packet that there was a recommendation of 2 months, generally speaking, as best practice, or about 16.7%. What I'm curious is how the council and the city thinks about that 11, 12, 13%, or what that general fund balance should be, or the range of what that should be. Does that make sense? My question makes sense?
That has been our policy for a long time, to keep it between 10 and 12.
Okay,
So we voted on that policy, a previous council did. And the thought is not having too much money sitting there doing nothing. We do have other capital accounts. That isn't our only lump of cash sitting around, so that's been debated before. I mean, we can change the policy if we want to, but we've been operating to that number informally for a long time, but
Since
formally for,
2018, yeah.
for about 5 years, yep.
sure. Not looking to change anything, just trying to understand
Sure.
the history behind it. That makes sense. In the case where funds were used from the general fund, how do you replenish the general fund? Where do those funds come from to replenish it?
You outperform your budget
Yeah.
year over year,
So it's
ideally.
surplus. Okay,
Surplus.
okay, got it. And the park impact, the increase that's seen there, what makes up that revenue or those fees that's coming into that line item?
My understanding is it's $900 per lot, new lot within the city. So,
Residential unit.
is it unit? Okay.
Okay, got
So-
it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, we're gonna turn the page now and start to
Just one more question.
Oh,
The-
I'm sorry.
No problem. The pre-funding to the fire department, and that the amounts inside that, are there plans for that to go back into the general fund, or is that gonna be slowly paid back through, like, their budget, or are we not getting them to pay that back, or what is the plan?
I think that was the timing issue Jen talked about.
Yeah, it's just a timing issue. It's really their operating, the funding that we owe them. We just gave it to them sooner.
The funding had to come in probably December so they could make payroll in
They were
January.
already
I
making
under-
payments in
I understand
December.
that, I mean, I understand
Yeah.
that, that's the reason why we did it, because they weren't,
It was just
all the things were filed
Q1
right away.
2023's money we gave in Q4 2022, so if there was a pot of money to write payroll to.
So you,
Would have been giving it to
so
him
you think
anyway.
by end of a year, that's gonna be rectified then for that?
Yes.
And that could be
Yes.
back in the general fund.
Right.
And then that puts us up to, back up to our,
About 2 million, which is 11%, so it's right within that.
that's
fi-
including that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. We're going to turn the page now and begin to look at budget development for 2024. And we'll start with the expense side and then shift gears and move over to the revenue side of the equation. WRS is the Wisconsin Retirement System. They offer up pensions to all of our employees who are eligible, mainly full-time and other part-time employees who meet a certain hourly threshold. The employer, or the city rather, contribution for retirement system payments will be going up 1.5% next year for general employees and over 8% for protective employees, which include all of our police department members. So those are two mandatory payments that we have to assume, or increases rather, that we'll be incorporating into our budget. Certainly the 1.5% is well within the realm of current inflation rates, but the 8.3% is not an insignificant number, and we'll be working to incorporate that into the draft budget that you see in a month. Health insurance, here's the whammy. We got original estimates from the state that provides our health insurance program back in early July that we would be looking at a 5 to 6% increase on insurance premiums, which is commensurate with what we've seen over the last number of years. The insurance board, the state insurance board, which sets premiums, then had a meeting in August to finalize or formally approve their rates, and based on some findings or recommendations from their staff on the investment returns and the reserves that they have, they apparently lost a fair amount of money in the stock market last year due to below market returns, and are now passing on those losses to the member communities through higher insurance premiums. So the estimate that we have, and we don't have final numbers and we probably won't until mid-September, is that the average increase for health insurance premiums for all members across the state of Wisconsin is going to be 14.6%. That is a huge number, and that is hundreds of thousands of dollars that we're potentially going to have to incorporate into our budget that's going to be presented to you. So we talk about holes. Building permits is a hole for this year. Election budget is in the hole due to that special election. Health insurance is a hole that we have to fulfill going into the next budgeting year. That's going to be our big challenge as we put together the spending plan over the next several weeks. Moving on, general insurance through the League of Wisconsin Municipalities. We met with their staff a few weeks ago. Across the board, amongst general liability, auto, property, etc., increases are ranging between 2 and 5%. If you know anything about property insurance and the world of property insurance right now, it's very expensive. And I think the choice that we made to pool through the League's program, whereby we are able to avail ourselves to better pricing through group purchasing, is paying dividends already through the premiums that we'll see on the property side. Some municipalities, some businesses are probably looking at increases in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% based on all of the losses that are occurring here in the commercial insurance market across the country. Our collective bargaining agreement, the CBA, with our police officers mandates a 2.75% increase for police officers and sergeants for 2024. Next year will be the last year of a 3-year agreement that we approved in late 2021 for our officers and our sergeants. So we'll be heading into negotiations next year, probably around mid-year, on a successor collective bargaining agreement, which will include certain cost of living adjustments for the years under which the new agreement is covered. We presented recommendations related to the compensation study to the council back in July. Staff is going to be working to incorporate the second phase recommendation, which was a longevity adjustment for existing employees of between 1% and 3%. The total amount of that phase 2 recommendation, as the council will recall, is in the neighborhood of about $80,000. And that's the recommendation that we'll be bringing forth, assuming we can fit everything else together, to keep us moving forward relative to those suggestions that were incorporated as part of that study. And then, within the packet, you saw a number of compulsory increases to the tune of about $233,000. Major drivers across that 4-page document include increased election expenses for 2024. It's a presidential year, and if the clerk can correct me, we usually see about 80% turnout here in Mequon. 85% turnout here in Mequon during presidential election years. That's a lot of absentee ballots, that's a lot of mail-in ballots, that's a lot of poll workers, that's a lot of people coming to our polling sites to vote. And so we have to be upstaffed and certainly ready on the supply front for those expenses. Road salt, we're seeing or anticipating a 9% increase, and then fuel, specifically within the police and the public works departments. Gas prices are annoyingly high right now, and I don't know that they'll be coming down anytime soon. So those are some of the major drivers that we're going to be confronting on the expenditure side.
Question.
Yes?
Back to health insurance, can you just remind me, I know that we're going through the state, and that's been our best rate in the past. Weren't we a hybrid of state and private before? I don't remember how that was set up. Is there an opportunity to shop some of that, or find ways to offset it?
You may recall, we've talked about this before. If you shop around, you're automatically kicked out of the plan for the next year. So before you can even see what your costs are, you're kicked out for the next year.
I just find it troubling as a community that we got a 14.6% increase for investment shortfalls.
Well, that's extremely troubling to me, because someone who guides the investments of WRS, who we have no oversight, made risky bets, lost a bunch of money, and is just passing it on to the people who fund them. Like, if Madison's not investigating that, they ought to be.
Can we put in a formal request just to have that reviewed?
Well, that's certainly on the list of items that we'll be discussing with our area legislators during our next round of meetings with them. We certainly have a new representative who's covering the west side of Mequon. We have Representative Andraka here on the east side of Mequon, and then we have newly elected Senator Knodel. We have good ongoing dialogue with at least 2 of the existing representatives, and we need to do some more outreach with the newly elected representative.
I do appreciate the conversations and the collaboration. I guess I'm just asking, with that hefty increase and knowing what that means to the city, and potentially, you know, if I don't see us making any changes, I just see us funding that in general. I think a formal inquiry, just in writing at some level, is my request at this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And I'm going to have some other feelers out from my office to the League of Wisconsin Municipalities to find out what other communities are doing relative to these increases. One other thing that we're going to be exploring as we go through budget process is a potential opt-out. And we talked about this last year relative to insurance, whereby if someone here with the city, an employee, has either single or family insurance, and they're able to get insurance either through their parents because they're under the age of 26, they're able to get insurance through their spouse who's employed and also has health insurance, we could provide a payment to that employee which is much less than what we would otherwise pay for their full premium expense, and realize a cost savings to the city and benefit the employee potentially, because they're not, we're not paying for insurance, they're getting extra money, and if they're not using it, that money is going to waste. So Human Resources is investigating that. Justin Shinneman is on partial paternity leave right now, but I tasked him with reviewing that, and we're going to have a conversation when he gets back into the office next week.
If that 14% remains the same, would the goal be to just keep the employee premiums the same, or would those have to go up, to recoup some of that, or what? How are you going to look at that?
Well, right now, the ratio that's been in place for a number of years here in the city and is subject certainly to collective bargaining provisions is 88% employer paid and 12% employee paid. So there is a premium contribution element that's in play, and when you talk about a 14% increase, that's going to also be borne on the backs of the employees who are contributing to the cost of insurance. So while the city will bear the brunt of most of these expenses, they will be shared with employees, and to the extent that we are able to fashion an opt-out program, I think we'd probably have some takers.
Let's do that.
That opt-out program is very common among school districts where they're saving lots of money by doing that, because a lot of times you have two people working, one takes the insurance, one doesn't, and then they save like for instance, commonly it's about $5,000 they'll give the employees per year to opt out, which is a great savings, because in order for premiums, you're talking $12,000, $13,000.
Yep.
So it would be something to pursue, because it could save the city a good deal of money on that. I know school districts have saved money on that too. So.
Well, our open enrollment process usually occurs in late September and goes until about mid to late October. So as we get into the nitty-gritty of making decisions on the budget, we may not have all of those decisions at the ready to necessarily impact the budget. But if we have a program in place and we have employees that are opting in to the opt-out program, we'll certainly realize those savings as we start to go through the budget year in 2024. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving targets, and we're going to certainly do our best to ameliorate the impact of that cost, because it affects everything else that we're trying to do as a city responsibly and from a service standpoint, whether it's taking care of our employees, appropriately funding our capital plan, or making sure that we have enough money in our budget for gas and road salt. So this is serious business, and we're gonna do our very best to limit the impacts where we can.
That 14.6 is a gut punch when you're expecting a 5 or 6%
Yes.
increase.
Yeah.
How nice we get more shared revenue in the same year where they jack up the insurance double-digit percentages.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one more clarification question? I think that, I know you went through this before, but, so is it that if we seek other bids for health insurance, we're blocked out of the WRS health plan? For a year or forever?
You're out for a year. So if you gamble and get your actuarial data to shop it around, you're automatically out for the next year.
But you can get opt
You
back
can get
in the
in the year, you're making a 1-year gamble.
It's hard to know. I don't know enough about this to know whether that gamble is worth it.
Do most Wisconsin municipalities participate in that program? Is it like the vast majority, or some self-funded, or is it hard to?
I don't have any hard figures at my fingertips, so it would be hard for me to answer that question. But it is another example of where communities, big, small, and mid-sized, have come together to pool resources and mitigate the overall expense based on shared pricing. So, this is going to be a hard nut to crack, but this is 1 year. And this is, I think, my 8th or 9th budget. We've never had an increase like this before. We've had years where it's been 1.1% or 3.6% or 5.2%. this is somewhat of an anomaly, but we're gonna have to tackle it here in real time.
But once you have a 15% increase and it's baked in from there, even if you get a 5% increase next year or a 3% increase, it's still a considerable amount of cash.
Absolutely.
It's never going back down.
It's never
only
going-
gonna continue to go
Yeah,
up. Yeah.
I mean, it's something we're gonna be dealing with that initial start of increase that's just huge for years, really.
Is that the assumption? I guess that's my question. Will we be dealing with this? There's a significant increase next year. Is there a level setting the year following when we don't have that investment income to make up? Or are they just are we at significant risk that they're
You're
gonna
not gonna
use the extra
decrease
funds?
it, I can
We don't
pretty much
know.
guarantee.
I mean, it's a sliding scale when they make bad investments. When they make good investments, I'd like to see it slide back in the favor of our community.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen.
It's hard for me
Maybe
to say.
salty inventing, I apologize, but.
But there have been years where health insurance rates through this program have decreased.
Okay,
So,
so it's a possibility.
2021, I have it up on my screen, it was like 4 or 5% that it decreased. But on average, over the 5-year period, it was a 3% increase. So I think it does
Okay, so it's
fluctuate,
possible
it
that
can go
might-
down, yep.
It might recalibrate, so that's
Good.
important to know, thank you.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Do we track our experience rating versus the premium dollars?
Outstanding.
What does that mean?
Ultimately, what it means is, do you track the costs of insurance, right, compared to the premium dollars? Because in the private world, you want to be at about 80% of your premium dollars. So if you're paying $1 million in premiums and you're running at about 80%, generally that means it's pretty much of a push. And next year, you wouldn't expect a large increase. So most of the time on your own, your experience rating, again, how much you're using the policy will impact what your increase is for the next year. So if your group is healthy, generally that's going to be favorable for you, right?
But we're
So-
pooled, aren't we, with all these other
Well, that's why I asked the question whether or not we track it as our
I'm
group.
not sure we've gone to that level, but I do recall having conversations with Mr. Shinneman about getting ETF or WRS in here to City Hall to meet and review our options for managing our health insurance costs. I think they're extraordinarily difficult to pin down and have meetings with because they are based in Madison. But you raise a good question, which is a data point that I think we could get even without a meeting per se. And that would give us a good indication as to whether or not we're over-insuring or if we're getting a really good bang for the buck in terms of the insurance premiums that were otherwise being charged.
Just be interesting information to have.
It would be.
Right.
So we'll write that down and follow up on that. Thank you.
I think that may be the data they're so protective of.
Yeah,
If you
Could
ask
be.
it and get it, then
Yeah.
yeah.
that's the same as you need that same information to go shop around and get insurance. I think that's the very info they're protective of. They've effectively running a monopoly, and there's no, it's not like you don't have any options, but it's a high risk proposition. You can't even go price it out to see if there's a better deal without getting kicked out.
So then just to follow up on that, is this part of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities that you referenced at the beginning?
No.
Or is this is something separate?
This is the state insurance program
Okay,
managed by the State Employee Trust Fund.
okay, got it, thank you.
Okay.
Public record?
What's that?
Generally public record on the experience rating then? So if we ask for the numbers, we should be able to get those without an objection?
We're going to try.
If we need a private citizen to ask for it, I can coordinate that as well.
Duly noted. All right, moving on to revenue considerations, and I'm going to hand it back over to Jen here in a moment. Just by way of background, the city tax rate is currently at $3.11 per $1,000 of assessed value. That stayed relatively stable over the last number of years, and as the council will recall, we went through a full revaluation process that wrapped up back in 2021, whereas our tax rate had worked its way up into the $3.28 or $3.30 range. It came back down to I think about 305, 304, and it's now slowly working back up by a couple of pennies a year. Through last year's budget process, I think the tax rate was $3.07, and the council at appropriations made some spending decisions to incorporate some additional dollars into the budget. Our current rate is $3.11. Net new construction for next year will provide approximately $225,000 of new available revenue. And our net new construction, which is, as you'll see here in a moment, probably a harbinger of a slowing development cycle that we're starting to identify in terms of a trend. Shared revenue, as we've talked about, the state included in their budget $580,000 or so in 2024. So that's available for us to use across a number of different areas within the general fund. So that's going to be a nice addition to our budget. The joint fire department that we now have with the village of Thiensville allows us to adjust the fire portion of the levy by the CPI plus 2%. So if there are additional expenses relative to staffing, which have been identified in the 5-year staffing plan that was part of the intergovernmental agreement executed with Thiensville, we are able to levy for additional dollars to meet those needs, be them staffing, be those capital, or other operational expenses that we've identified and that we want to build into this joint fire department that we're building with the village. As noted earlier, building permit fees are down, and we're likely going to see a lower revenue number for next year. So we're not only dealing with this year and the fact that we won't make budget, we're going to be tailoring that number accordingly. On the flip side, interest income is up, as we saw earlier, and we'll probably be able to plug in or program a higher number for 2024. As was also mentioned in the cover memo in tonight's budget meeting packet, we're anticipating a decrease in the use of ARPA funds in next year's budget. In 2022, we used $200,000 of ARPA funding. We used $200,000 in this year's budget, but we're starting to wean ourselves off of that ARPA funding because eventually it will go away, and rather than leaving a $200,000 hole in our budget, we want to start to work that number down here in the last year where we can spend it. And so 2024 will likely include a number less than $200,000.
Okay, so taking a look at net new construction. So what is net new construction? It is just the new construction that occurred within Mequon. And it is net of any demolitions that take place, and it also includes the various TID the tax increment districts, including such as the town center. So we're taking a look at a 5-year history, and so the increased percent, so the net new construction figure is divided into the equalized value to arrive at the percent, and the equalized value is at about 6.5 billion. And so if you look at the last, 5 years, we're tracking in the 1 to 2%, and as Will suggested, we're closer to the 1%. So that is a reflection of, the increased interest rates, the reduction of building permits, and just the general activity that's happening within the city. And then there's Azakia County overall, the increase that they're experiencing, and we're pretty much tracking fairly nicely to that. And then what it does, that net new construction, now we have, new tax dollars, it gives us some funds to include in our budget without really increasing the tax rate. So, can move on to the tax levy limit. So in 2005, Wisconsin implemented a new levy limit law. So there is a maximum amount allowed as, within the city on property tax parcels. And so essentially you have to have net new construction in order to increase the levy. If you don't have, new construction, new activity going on, within your municipality, you are, or your county, you really do not have the ability to increase the levy. There are some exceptions, but it's essentially a use it or lose it mentality. So if you choose not to use this, say 1.18%, which is also very meager in terms of the inflationary, when we're having 9% inflationary, it's difficult to keep up with those costs. But if you don't add that to the levy base, then you're essentially, you don't have it then the next year, because it resets using that levy. It carries forward, and now you're using next year's net new construction. And then debt service. So you can take on more debt. It's exempt, and it will increase the tax rate, but it's exempt from the levy limit rules. And then this is both city and sewer included. So how it's looked at is in consolidation. In total, it's not a separate calculation or process for the city versus the sewer. So for example, last year, the city really needed to increase funds to support SOFT or Southern Ozaki and the library and other things. But what that meant was that the sewer utility kept their levy flat, thus reducing their tax rate. So there is notably there is interplay between the sewer utility and the city. So we're estimating the levy capacity to be right around $275,000 this year, but we're still working to finalize that figure with our municipal advisors. It's still early in the process.
For reference, last year, roughly a penny was
About 50,000 or 53,000. Mm-hmm.
So we've got a nickel to play with, max.
What was the issue we ran into last year, like last minute, it felt like, with the sewer, where we were trying to plan for some big expenses, and then we realized we hit the levy limit, and what is the plan? How are we gonna account for that this year then?
Well, as Jennifer, or Director Engeroff rather, pointed out, the net new construction, or estimated levy capacity, there's an interplay between the city and the sewer utility levy, because it's considered one levy by the Department of Revenue. So last year, we committed all of the available dollars under the city's net new construction and available levy, and that crowded out the consideration of anything on the sewer side when we got to the sewer and the water utility budgets. For years, we've had excess levy capacity, but through adding full-time positions to the fire department, doing other things across the organization, increasing our capital funding, we've now come to the point where we are bumping up against the hard levy limit. And we don't have the unfettered ability to continue raising our tax rate beyond where it is now. And so we have to be more mindful and more careful of balancing the needs of the sewer utility with the general fund relative to net new construction and excess levy capacity. So we've got shared revenue, which is going to provide certainly some available funds for this year and maybe even into future budgeting years. We're going to be going through a process to potentially adjust fees on our existing fee schedule, which could provide some additional revenues. We're going to have to look at any and all ways to expand or enhance our ability to raise revenues, because our expenses are not going to go down. They're going to continue to rise, and some of those are well beyond our control, i.e. gasoline and the price of road salt. So we're going to be taking this into mind as we put together the general fund budget, to answer your question, Alderman Parrish. And relative to the sewer utility, one of the projects that's coming down the pike is the East Trunk Sewer, or I'm sorry, not the East Trunk Sewer, the Lift Station E project, which has an estimated cost of around $6 million. As pointed out here on the screen, debt service levy is exempt from levy limit rules. So if we want to borrow funds to complete that project, those proceeds and any corresponding increase in the tax rate is not subject to levy limits. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to consider as we get into that conversation on the sewer utility budget. How do we want to pay for that Lift Station E project? Very likely, it's going to be through debt service. And being a $6 million project, I don't know that we could ever raise user fees to the point where it would pay for that project without issuing debt. Hopefully I answered your question.
It's great. I'll save the rest of it for when we do the sewer budget
Yeah.
another night.
Yeah.
Thank
But
you.
we're conscious of that complication, that complicating factor that we ran into last year, and we're certainly incorporating into our calculus for this year's budget development process. So thank you for the question.
So the debt service levy is only for new issued?
I'm sorry?
So the debt service levy exempt is only for new issued
That is
debt?
correct.
Okay.
Yes, so any new debt that the city would issue on a going forward basis is exempt from the levy limits.
I know that. I was just trying to have the distinction in between, can it be used for old debt or it's just new issue debt?
That's been the rule for some time, but in the past, we have tried to tuck those debt service payments within our existing number. We don't have to, but we have in the past. I think what Administrator Jones is suggesting is we may not have that luxury forever.
So, continuing on the revenue theme, we talked a little earlier about state shared revenue. The particulars of the legislation that was approved and signed into law by the governor earlier this year allows localities to receive one penny of the 5-cent state sales tax starting in 2024. As mentioned, this will provide just under $600,000 of new recurring revenue to the city on a year-over-year basis. Given that state sales tax revenues have grown in each of the last 20 years, as measured by the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, we expect this revenue source to continue to grow in future years for the benefit of the city. These revenues can be used statutorily for expenses related to police, fire, public works, transportation, and any court costs that a locality might have. The personal property tax was also eliminated as part of the new 2-year state budget. We will no longer have to collect the personal property tax starting next year. That's going to create some economies of scale from a staffing standpoint that we're going to be looking at longer term. And the state, as part of the elimination of the PPT, is going to provide replacement income to all municipalities that previously collected this revenue. So, we'll be getting another payment from the state equivalent to what we collected in 2023 for the personal property tax, which we will no longer have to collect. And then I talked about the fee schedule just a few moments ago. Just to recap our recent history here, fees were last reviewed comprehensively in 2020 during the COVID pandemic and adjusted for fiscal year 2021. This year's review commenced earlier in the spring, and we used 12 communities to survey of the 20 communities that were included as comparables in our recently completed compensation study. The department heads met as a group and decided which fees we were going to compare. There are many fees within our fee schedule that are either unique to Mequon or that are set by state statute, like liquor license fees, that it really made no sense to spend staff time comparing against other municipalities. The Department of Public Works, which oversees parks, also reviewed a number of other fees internally. Those are more unique to Mequon. Well, they didn't compare them, but they looked at those fees to ensure that they continue to reflect the cost that we incur for providing those services. The data is now under review by departments, and they are tasked with getting their recommendations back to the budget team by next week, September 5th. And then we're going to be bringing recommendations forward to the Finance and Personnel Committee and the council later this fall, likely starting next month and into October, with an eye towards incorporating any adjustments into the fee schedule for the start of 2024. So that'll be another to-do on our list and certainly your list as we bring forward materials related to the adoption of next year's budget. So, when you wrap it all up, just wanted to share real quick as we hit the 7 o'clock hour, the budget team's priorities over the next 4 weeks. Number one, we certainly want to fulfill all of our obligations related to salary and benefits on behalf of the workforce here in the city, which comprises more than 70% of our operating budget. We want to seek to address those compulsory needs outlined in the packet, which are the result of inflation or other mandatory expenses that we cannot negotiate or we need to incorporate into our budget. The capital plan, which we'll get into here momentarily, is an opportunity if we have additional revenues or resources where we want to continue to boost pay-as-you-go capital funding. We have needs across our buildings, our roads, within our fleet, across the two departments, police and public works in particular, where we're not meeting the otherwise identified needs for annual replacement. And so if we can boost capital funding going into next year, we're going to certainly look at that opportunity. We'll have some supplemental funding requests, although the number of requests received this year is less than in future years. Those will be on the table for the Appropriations Committee to consider when they meet in October. And then, as I alluded to earlier, if we're able to preserve additional revenue capacity into future years, that's going to play very well to support our overall concept and goal of maintaining financial stewardship of the city's resources, not only into next fiscal year, but for future fiscal years and beyond. So, just wanted to share with all of you where staff's head's at in terms of budget development over the next month or so. So let's turn the page to capital financing. And as noted in the packet this evening, net capital requests for 2024 were totaling about $3.3 million. Included in that figure was the permanent repair of the City Hall HVAC system. The council will recall that we had a catastrophic failure of the air conditioning unit in this portion, the older portion of City Hall, earlier this year. We authorized some emergency repairs to the tune of about $16,000 or so, but that is a patchwork repair. And we've got some permanent fixes. A couple of options were presented from our contractor between $50,000 and $240,000. And we're going to be looking at ways in which we can move forward on that into 2024. We can feel the air conditioning in this room right now, but there's no guarantee that we'll have heat and air conditioning for years on end. And so we're going to have to incorporate that into our planning and our budgeting on the capital side for 2024. Next year is also the third and last year of the road program borrowing that we issued back in 2022. The total amount of that debt issue was $9.6 million at an interest rate of 1.8%. Those were the days. I'm not sure we would get that if we went back out to market, but we've got another 16 or 18 months before we may have to consider a debt issue for 2025 and beyond. Hopefully interest rates will be coming down and working in our favor. And typically municipal bond rates are lesser than what you see on the general interest rate market. So us being a AA+ community, we're a good credit risk, and we may have some premium accruing to us from an interest rate perspective there. On the debt service side, we expect that figure, which is $2.8 million, to remain level in 2024. We've got a couple of slides that'll be coming up, which will show more of that here in a moment. And on a combined basis, our pay-as-you-go capital and debt service are equivalent to about $4.1 million. And on a $17.3 million budget, that's almost 25% of where we're spending spending our proceeds. So debt service for the money we've borrowed for the Public Works facility, the Highland Road interchange, the road program every 3 years, as well as the pay-as-you-go capital in the amount of about $1.3 million. The ARPA program that we approved last year is certainly helping to address some of the capital projects or requests that have been included in the annual capital plan. Lemke and the brush site come to mind off the top of my head. And since 2015, we've increased PAYGO funding by just over 50%. So here's a summary of where we've been on pay-as-you-go funding going all the way back to 2015. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, $2.5 million was requested, and we were funding at about $870,000 in any one year. Fast forward up to 2023, the number of projects requested has increased to $3.6 million, and last year we were able to fund just under $1.35 million. So as I mentioned earlier, this is an area of focus for the budget team and the staff in general. We want to continue to increase these amounts over time so that we can incorporate not only inflationary costs relative to the purchase of vehicles and petroleum-based products that go towards road paving and resurfacing, but also the ability to get more done and protect our public assets, whether it's buildings, equipment, or vehicles. Drilling a little deeper, here's the pay-as-you-go detail that was included in the budget packet as well. This gives you just a quick overview of the projects or the categories that were funded in 2023. We haven't gotten to a point where we finalized any numbers for 2024, thus that column is blank. But you can see most of our expenses relate to the police department, public works, annual road maintenance, and then smaller categories such as parks, emerald ash borer removals, information technology. We just started a capital fund for that last year, and this year we're very happy to say that we've installed electric service out here for the Taste of Mequon. We took some interest income on the capital account, and we're able to get that one-time project done. That's been on the capital plan for almost 10 years now, and that's actually saving us $2,500 a year on generator and electricity expenses that we would otherwise have to bring in and that we've been doing over time. So that's our project detail. I would anticipate many of these numbers will be the same across these categories going into 2024, and where we can, we'll look to add categories or even increase these numbers if at all possible. Alderman Bach.
So what happens on the 2 million that, let's say, doesn't get funded in capital, or the requests, whatever it was, so what happens to those requests? So I saw in the packet, all the different requests and the priorities from the department manager and all that. So the ones that don't get funded, does this whole process then get started again, or do those ones that aren't funded get put in a spreadsheet and say, Public Works, submitted these last year, and we're going to hold those, or does that just get wiped and they just start all over again and make those same requests?
Well, we have what's otherwise known as a 5-year capital plan, and every year the departments update that capital plan based on the year that we're in falling off, and then the next year being added on 5 years out. And so the capital plan is updated on an annual basis. The Lemke Park Pavilion and the brush site historically have been in the capital plan. You did not see any requests for those in the capital plan because we've identified an alternative funding source for those needs. And where we can, we're going to devote additional resources to those capital expenses. But to answer your question truthfully and honestly, we are underfunding on our identified capital needs and have been doing such for many, many years. We're spreading the limited resources that we have available, and this is not a problem that most other municipalities don't have as well. We're not able to fund everything as otherwise requested.
Do you fund most of the priority ones from the department managers? When have they prioritized, or is it, although everybody's probably gonna say it's a high priority?
Well, you know, I was going through the capital plan just today in preparation for the meeting. And I read through one of the projects that was listed as a priority. I think it was maybe priority 2. It was the car washing station at Public Works. And there was a very good argument made by the director, Lundeen, about how this would extend the life of our vehicles if we were to incorporate a washing capability into our Public Works facility. Now, given the amount of money that we have and all the other things that we need to fund, staff, benefits, and otherwise, you know, one idea that crossed my mind was taking $250,000 out of the DPW vehicles and equipment line item up there on the screen for 1 year and getting that wash station built. Now, I have not had that conversation with Director Lundeen, and my guess is she would probably say, hell no, if I made that suggestion. So, you know,
But that's a good example of how you kind of.
it's a balancing act,
Yeah.
and we have limited resources. What we want to do is keep growing that number so we can address a higher percentage of the identified needs. Going back one slide, the amount requested is actually down from where it was just 2 years ago. We were at 3.9, now we're at 3.3. That tells me the ARPA funds that we're using and the increases that we're getting back to coming out of the COVID years, we're able to chip away at some of those identified needs. And, you know, the one-time projects like the festival's electric or the wash bay station, we're gonna seek to continue to address those in order to manage those overall numbers on a year-over-year basis.
Thank you.
So, moving right along into the debt financing portion of this evening's discussion, and I don't know that we'll spend a lot of time here. This is more of a teaser for the strategic planning workshop we're hoping to have with the council early next year, where we're gonna talk about civic campus master planning, where we're gonna talk about long-term facility planning, and any other debt financing programs or expenditures that we want to consider. But you can see here, within 10 years, by 2032, which I think is the 75th anniversary of the city of Mequon's incorporation, by 2032, we will be debt-free. We will have paid off all of our existing debt, which includes debt for the Public Works facility. It includes all of the 3-year road borrowing program money that we've borrowed, and special assessment debt that's hanging on from the early 2010s. We've got a little TID 2 and TID 3 debt, and then we've got debt related to the sewer utility for the East Trunk sewer extension. That was a $15 million project that was where we borrowed money back in 2016. But on the GO side, general obligation debt, which is issued by the city, our net tax levy impact here, and this is the amount that's actually included in the budget. These are our principal and interest payments. They're continuing to go down, and they will go down every year over the next 9 fiscal years to the point where we don't have any debt starting in 2033. And if we think about facilities like the public safety headquarters, like the East Side Fire Station, maybe the community pool, those are assets and those are projects where if you were to borrow money for those projects, you would probably extend the debt or the life of that debt out over 20 years as opposed to 10 years like we do for roads, or 15 years as we've done for, say, the Highland Road interchange and the East Trunk sewer project. You could even go out 25 or 30 years if the interest rates are favorable. And so there is, I won't call it unlimited capacity to borrow, but we are entering a realm here going into this strategic planning check-in that we're hoping to have, where I think we can have some serious, robust discussions about what we want to do on a on a very ambitious basis relative to some of our larger capital assets. And again, I'm talking public safety buildings, community pool, and maybe even to a lesser extent, some targeted improvements here at City Hall. Now that comes with the recognition that we're still going to have to borrow for roads every 3 years, but we're going to be working with our financial advisor, Ellers, over the next couple of months as we sort of wind up budget and we get that in your hands. We're going to be preparing for that workshop so that we can begin to drive some decision-making and get some traction on where we're going to go from a long-term borrowing perspective, and maybe getting professionals in here such as space planners and architects and so forth, so that we can begin addressing what the council decides as what your number one or number two priorities are relative to this opportunity. This slide is sort of another version of what I just showed you. It's the non-numerical version, and you can see here, these are the older debt issues that are falling off. These are the 2013 notes. I think this is a rather small borrowing. Maybe it was a refunding. These are 2015 bonds that were borrowed for the road program, but they were taken out over 13 years, and you can see the majority of the principal and the interest was backloaded, such that we're still paying that off now here into the late 2020s. This green tranche here on the chart is actually the 2016 bond issue, which was the 8.9 million rather debt issue for the Public Works facility expansion and consolidation. And you can see that we're going to be paying that off all the way out until 2032. That was a 15 to 16 year debt issue, which is appropriate for the upgrade to a facility. And so we extended that out over 10 years, but then again, we kept it short. Here's the 2019 issue. This was just roads. You can see the lesser impact that this has had. This will actually get paid off before the Public Works facility. And then this is the most recent issue, $9.6 million in geo debt. This was for the road program at about 5.1, and then the Highland Road interchange, which was almost another two. I want to say about $7 million, 6.5 to $7 million. We kept that debt very short. We're just starting to pay the principal and interest this year, and we kept it within 10 years so that we have capacity out here in the 2030s to take on larger projects for our next facility or facilities. This is really the best use of debt. Some municipalities, which maybe are not managed as well as Mequon, will issue bonds for equipment, such as fire trucks and ambulances or other heavy equipment. That certainly could be an option that we consider, but it increases the cost that we ultimately pay for a physical asset that doesn't have as long a life as a building, per se, or a road or a bridge. So just as an example, an ambulance, you might get 15 years out of an ambulance, but you could get 50 years out of a building. That's why you want to borrow for financing relative to hard assets, which are going to be here for the long term and actually be a lesser cost once they're paid off. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on this here tonight. It's not really germane to a lot of what you'll see in the budget that comes your way in the next 4.5 weeks. But nevertheless, we wanted to just give you an update on where we were from a capital pay-as-you-go standpoint, as well as a debt financing issue, so that you can begin to think strategically, just as we are, about where we see the city going as we start to drive some of this decision-making relative to our strategic plan and relative to our ability to pay for it in a responsible manner. Alderman Parrish, I saw your hand up.
This is a really good depiction for us to visualize debt long-term and how we're going to pay for important things like fire stations and things of that nature. I'm just wondering if the model needs to be updated to reflect the 3-year, because we're projecting total debt payoff by 2033. So it's kind of a policy thing, but every 3 years we do a $3 million borrow for the roads. So I would think the model needs every 3 years that would show in here.
Absolutely. And in some previous discussions with our financial advisor, they've run those scenarios or those sensitivity analyses, for lack of a better term. This is really our existing GO debt base case. This is our base debt right now here as we stand. As part of any discussions that we would want to have with the council going into early next year, we would want to actually program those road borrowings with some anticipated interest rates, some anticipated adjustments to the overall value, equalized value of the community, to make sure that the numbers that you're looking at support good long-term decision-making. So, very good point. We just want to give you sort of the base case right now. Alderman Bach.
Does this mean that that you wouldn't tackle any big projects like a public safety building until 2032, or you could start planning that now and incur that debt?
Assuming we get the nod, and there's consensus amongst this group to move forward with initial planning efforts on one or more projects, those efforts could begin in 2024.
Oh, okay.
And we're actually already on our way to doing a space needs analysis for public safety on both the police and fire side. We're hoping to have the results of that effort available for the council to review, maybe even as early as late this year, or at the very latest in conjunction with the strategic planning workshop we want to have starting next year.
That's good.
Okay, moving right along. We talked about the component units, the Wyenberg Library, and as the council will recall, as part of our budget deliberations last year to formulate this year's spending plan, $46,000 in new funding was provided to the Wyenberg Library as part of their annual operating budget, and $150,000 was also earmarked as part of the approved ARPA spending plan, also adopted by the council last year. Coming out of last year's discussions and deliberations, direction was given to myself and others on the staff to meet with library staff to review their budget, as well as the Village of Thiensville to examine the joint funding agreement, which has been in place for, I think, about 2 decades. Director Mushin Young, who is here tonight with the library board treasurer, and she and I met with the business manager from the library over a half dozen meetings between March and August. We also included staff from the Village of Thiensville, the League of Wisconsin Mutual Insurance, as well as the city, to look at all areas in the budget where we thought we could find some potential opportunities for economies of scale and savings. As I pointed out in my summary findings memo, the library also already does a lot to save money and to work with its partners here, both locally through the city as well as the village, and as members of the Monarch Library System. They are doing anything and everything in their power to be as frugal and fiscally responsible as I've seen in any organization that I've worked with. So as part of our review, we excluded their staff expenses, which are wages and benefits, and that's 70% of their budget, as well as their program and collection expenses. That's everything that they loan out or make available or do on behalf of the community. That's only 12% of their budget, and that number's been going down on a year-over-year basis. So we excluded those 2 items from the review, and we focused on administrative and operational expenses where, we have similar expenses, the village has similar expenses. Where are there further opportunities to collaborate? And amongst the findings that were included in the memo, we agreed to continue to share information on vendors, because they have a couple of vendors that we want to look at. We have some vendors that we're very happy with, and they're going to talk to. We want to consult them on all of their building repairs and projects. We have some in-house expertise amongst our buildings staff and our public works department that we think can be of real value to the library. And then future actions. which were listed in the memo and are up here on the screen. These are sort of the action points or future steps that we're going to be pursuing with the library and the city and potentially the village to further economize and save money on their budget. Quickly, just looking at the screen, we're going to be looking at a joint audit contract with the village and the library and the city. We all use the same auditor. We think there's potential there. Combining the library and the village's payroll, they both use ADP. We just approved a new comprehensive printer and copier contract on the city side across all of our buildings last year. We're going to see if there's a way to get the library on that contract. We're going to look at postage, investment, looking at maybe adjusting or even discontinuing the fiscal agent fee that the library pays to the village of Thiensville. And then the library is going to continue to monitor their insurance coverages to see if there's any potential for savings on either the policy side or the deductible side. And one very frank conversation I had with the library staff is, the city manages our premiums by taking on a higher deductible. We're a pretty good risk, and we don't need all of our deductibles at zero. The library has a little bit of a different philosophy, having a smaller budget and lesser reserves, but we've started the conversation, and I think through their finance committee and their board, they're going to continue to explore that opportunity as a potential way for managing risk and managing expenses. I don't want to speak for the library director or the board treasurer, but that was another area of opportunity where we saw it fit to be included in the list of recommendations. So that quickly summarizes the memo that was included in the packet. Are there any questions that I can answer here?
Well, where does this conversation go? There's a lot of thoughts I could rattle off, but I don't know if this is the appropriate time for that.
Well, these are future action steps that we're going to be pursuing in the near term and maybe the midterm.
But updating the agreement itself that's also a priority, right?
That's the next step, yes.
And that's, I guess, because that's where we were concerned about just contributions from Thiensville, and is the contribution percentages equitable, and what is the fiscal agent fee every year? How much are they paying for that?
Currently, and the library director is here and she can correct me if I misstate anything, the library pays an $8,000 fee to the village of Thiensville to serve as their fiscal agent. And that covers all accounting, payroll, and accounts receivable and accounts payable services on behalf of the library.
So I strongly believe that should go away, or we should start charging like property management fees and things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, contributing our staff time, things like that. I mean, if both municipalities are going to start charging for things like that, there's a lot we could be charging at the SOFD level and at the library level, and I just don't think we want to go there. So Thiensville is not up their increase. They barely ever up their contributions. It's always the city of Mequon and our taxpayers that pays more. So I think that should also be a guiding philosophy, that if there's any increases this year, any requests, that it should be commensurate with the village of Thiensville, because we're partners. It's not just us paying more. So I would request that the fiscal agent fee go away, or we need to make it more equitable, because we're giving a lot of staff time. Justin with human resources, things like that. I mean, we give a lot of our human intellectual capital to make our partners more efficient.
That we
So
do.
if we're going to start assigning values to that, I don't think that's healthy. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the Southern Ozaki Fire and EMS Department. Touched on this in the memo as well, and this factors into the overall budget development process. This is a rather new approach that we've taken since merging with the village officially as of January 1st. Last year, we put together a separate companion budget for the Southern Ozaki Fire and EMS Department. It was the first ever budget, so we were budgeting on spec in some terms. And by and large, the budget that we put together on an expenditure side has worked out very well. We've had somewhat of a lag in collecting ambulance revenues and fees, and that's related to the startup challenges that we've had with Medicare and the federal government and getting certain employer ID numbers and so forth that are required for the disbursement of drugs and other needed treatments in the field. Long story short, we are now billing for all of the ambulance runs and collecting on all of the ambulance runs that we've made in 2023. And the chief is very confident that by the end of the year, we're going to collect all of the money that's been billed out relative to the budget that was prepared and approved, and maybe even exceed the amount of revenue that we calculated as part of this initial budget. But looking ahead into next year, we're anticipating a few modifications on the revenue side. We looked at our comparable fire and EMS agencies, and we think there's some room to further adjust our ambulance fees. Inspections revenue is anticipated to come in significantly higher than we originally budgeted, and so we will be adjusting that number as well. We are going to be recommending a modest adjustment to the tax levy for both the village and the city that is otherwise allowed by the state for joint fire departments. Currently, the CPI plus 2%, as I talked about earlier, is the provision. It's a 12-month rolling CPI, which at last check was 5% through 12 months, July 31st of this year. So if you take 5 plus 2, we could raise the fire portion of the city's levy and the fire portion of the village's levy by 7% by law. The draft budget that we're working on now and that we'll be finalizing Friday morning with the village contemplates a 5% adjustment, not a 7% adjustment. So we're not going to take it to the max, but if we look a little down below under expenses, we are going to be absorbing 50% of the city's mechanics costs for the department starting in 2024. In 2023, as part of our startup expenses, and this goes to your very point just a few moments ago, Alderman Parrish, the city has been providing mechanical services, fleet repair services on a complimentary basis to the department, and Thiensville has made no contribution to that effect. That's going to change in 2024 as we've consolidated our fleets and began selling off some of our surplus equipment, and SOFD is going to be assuming the full cost or half of the cost for our mechanic who spends 50% of his time on fire and EMS equipment. We're also hoping to add one new firefighter paramedic in order to keep marching along on that 5-year staffing plan that was part of the intergovernmental agreement. And then there are cost of living adjustments for all of the staff, both on the paid on call side and the full-time firefighter paramedic side and command staff side that we're hoping to incorporate as well. The SOFD board will be reviewing this budget at its meeting on September 13th, and pending their concurrence and approval that night or at a meeting shortly thereafter, we'll be incorporating those numbers into the village and the city budgets for consideration in October. I should also add the one other bullet point on the screen. The budget that we're preparing contemplates $300,000 in ARPA funding from Ozaukee County. That was also the number that was included in the 2023 budget. There are ongoing discussions at the county board level. That $300,000 number may actually go up by another $200,000 or so, which would be actually a real boost to the fire department's capital fund. And we talked about underfunding capital needs relative to equipment and so forth. We're hopeful that those ARPA funds, which come strings unattached, will give us even more of a head start towards addressing the fire department's capital needs long-term so that they don't become a huge burden for the city as we're trying to address our separate needs on the police and public works and parks side. So, just an update. This will be another separate budget within the larger city budget that you'll be seeing as part of the package that goes out in about 4 weeks. So that takes us to ARPA. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time here. This is really not tied into anything that we're doing relative to the operating budget that'll be coming your way. But here's the plan that was put together and adopted by the council last year in November. And as we go back to one of the first slides tonight, it lines up with 4 out of the 5 key focus areas contained within the city's strategic plan. I mentioned earlier the plan that was approved included a lesser amount of funding, or contemplated a lesser amount of funding. We're going to try and hit that target for 2024 so that we don't have a bigger hangover going into 2025. And then, as was included in the packet, this is a tracking mechanism that was recently put together by the finance department so that we could get real-time updates on where we've spent money relative to those approved allocations. The items listed at the top are projects that are currently underway and that have mostly been completed relative to the plan. Electronic poll books, the police telephone recorder, and the county line traffic signal have all mostly been paid for in totality. The city budget, we've spent the $400,000 in the last 2 years. We've got 1 more year to go with the aforementioned target of $67,000. The land management system, that project was put on pause pending the hire of a new IT director. He's been in the building now for about 6 weeks. We're looking to reignite that effort here in the 4th quarter of this year because we've got money to spend and we want to make sure that that balance is appropriated by December 31st of next year and then spent by the end of 2026 towards a new land management system for all of our residents, developers, and others working on their respective properties and homes here in the city. A couple of other areas where we spent some but not all of the proceeds include the library, the Munis module implementation, which is currently underway with business licensing, and then the staffing study that was completed late last year as well. A couple other projects that have not been, where we haven't spent any money, include the Civic Campus Master Plan, the brush site automation in the Lemke Park Pavilion. This project is going to be bid out here in the 4th quarter of the year. The brush site, we're already doing some preliminary work. We anticipate a committee of the whole discussion either late this year or early next year. And Civic Campus Master Plan will be part of that strategic planning workshop that we're going to have early in 2024. So all in, we've spent or encumbered about $1 million of the 2.5. Our challenge is to make sure this 1.6 million is fully appropriated by the end of next year. So that's going to be a key area of focus for staff. And while it's offline from the budget, it still has spending implications that are going to come forward and certainly impact this group, the Common Council. Any questions on ARPA? Okay. Last slide. Next steps. We're here tonight with our workshop meeting to get the council up to speed on where we are as we begin to put together the budget. As I mentioned, it'll be going out in less than a month. We've preliminarily scheduled the Appropriations Committee meeting for October 9th. That's a Monday. That's the night before our regular council meeting on October 10th. That is the night, amongst all the dates that we solicited to the council, that worked best for the majority. So we're going to have back-to-back nights, and if we do a good job, this group won't be going late on the 9th. I heard there's a Packers game that night, too. They're playing on Monday Night Football. So with any luck, we'll work hard and make your job easy. Then we've got time in mid-October for a second Appropriations Committee meeting if necessary. We haven't had to do that in well over a number of years, and we're hoping we can get it done in one night here this year as well. And then we'll be rolling into sewer and water budget meetings in late October, early November, in advance of publishing the public hearing notice for the budget prior to budget adoption, which is scheduled for November 14th. So I'm all talked out. I'm happy to answer any questions that the council has. The department heads are mostly here. I know Director Mushin Young is here from the library if there are any questions. But tonight's really not about decisions, it's more about listening. And if you all have any input or thoughts coming out of tonight's discussion that you want to share with the budget team, please feel free to reach out to Jennifer, myself, or any of the department heads, and we'll be sure to incorporate those perspectives and that information into our efforts over the next couple of weeks. Director Engroff, anything you want to add?
No? Nothing else?
Okay. Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
It's time to get the questions out. I talk to these guys every week, so. Any parting questions? If not, you always know where to email
Yeah.
Will and the team, so.
I'll be in the office every day until the budget goes out, so you'll know where to find me.
Great overview. One of
That
the
was
best you've
great.
done.
Good
Yeah,
job.
very good.
Very efficient explanation, yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, there's only one motion we can make tonight.
Move
Motion
to adjourn. Ah, second.
Sound like a motion and
In
a second.
stereo.
All those in
Paper, rock,
favor,
scissors,
please say
you go
aye.
first.
Aye.
Any opposed? Adjourned.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was